It was 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and sunlight poured through the windows of her colonial-style home in the quiet neighborhood of Preston Hollow. Sitting in the living room, April Hayes wrapped her hands around a warm cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on a framed photograph. In the picture, her husband, Daniel, stood in his white coat, offering a soft smile to the camera. The photo had been taken last summer on his 33rd birthday, a surprise celebration arranged by his colleagues at UT's Southwestern Medical Center. No matter how hectic his schedule as an oncologist got, Daniel always carried that calm, reassuring expression. April's eyes drifted from the picture to the garden outside, where the flowers they had nurtured together bloomed under the early summer sun. Gardening had been their shared escape on weekends, a quiet joy they both cherished. By the white rose bush, Daniel would sometimes pluck a petal and gently tuck it into April's long brown hair, telling her it suited her perfectly. Their story had begun 3 years ago at a wedding, Jennifer's wedding. April, a freelance graphic designer, had been hired to capture the event when she crossed paths with Daniel, a college friend of the groom. They hit it off effortlessly while helping out with last-minute wedding arrangements, and from that moment on, their connection grew naturally. 6 months later, they made the decision to get married. But not everyone approved. April's mother, Margaret, had been vocal about her disapproval. "Being a doctor's wife isn't the right life for you," she had warned. A former high school teacher, Margaret was meticulous and cautious, and she questioned her daughter's choice. "A doctor's wife spends too many nights alone. Someone with your kind heart won't be able to handle that." Ever since losing her husband 10 years earlier, Margaret had become deeply involved in April's life, always trying to guide her decisions. But April refused to back down. Maybe that stubborn streak was something she inherited from her mother. "I've made my choice," she had said, unwavering. For a moment, Margaret had seemed surprised by her daughter's determination. In the end, she had no choice but to accept it. Married life, however, wasn't without its challenges. Just as her mother had predicted, Daniel's unpredictable hospital shifts meant April had to adjust her freelance work schedule constantly. But surprisingly, their routine worked. She spent her days designing in her home office, and when she could, she brought meals to Daniel at the hospital. On the rare days when he had time off, they attended services at Highland Park United Methodist Church before stopping by Whole Foods to shop for groceries. Evenings were often spent at their favorite burger joint, Maple and Motor. Life was hectic but happy, and April had assumed it would continue that way. She placed her coffee cup down and reached for her phone. The screen displayed a message from 3 months ago, the last one Daniel had ever sent her. "I'll be home late tonight, but I promise I'll be there. I love you." That night, he never came home. At the hospital, the diagnosis was clear: acute heart failure. A heart attack brought on by exhaustion. He had given everything he had to his patients, pushing himself beyond his limits. And now, in the photograph, he still wore that same gentle smile. April let out a slow breath and stood up. Today was Daniel's funeral. She slipped into a white dress, pausing in front of the mirror. Her reflection showed not grief, but a quiet strength, a readiness to face what lay ahead. The spire of Highland Park United Methodist Church stretched toward the overcast sky. It was unusually chilly for a June day in Dallas. Black cars arrived one after another, filling the church parking lot. Inside, over 200 people had gathered: friends, family, and Daniel's colleagues from UT's Southwestern Medical Center. In a small room off to the side, April adjusted the collar of her dress and took a deep breath. The reflection staring back at her in the mirror felt unfamiliar. She had barely slept in 3 days. The makeup did little to hide the dark circles under her eyes, but maybe that was fitting. She felt as exhausted as she looked. "April, it's time," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Jennifer, the same friend whose wedding had brought her and Daniel together 3 years ago. Jennifer had taken time off and flown in from New York just to be here today. "I know," April replied, her voice rougher than she expected. Inside the church, soft light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting a warm glow over Daniel's memorial portrait on the altar. He was smiling in his white coat, the smile April had loved so much. The one that had reassured his patients, the one that had defined his purpose as a doctor. The pastor's voice echoed gently through the church. Dr. Daniel Hayes was a man who saved lives and gave hope to so many. From her seat in the front row, April could hear quiet sobs behind her. When she turned, she saw them, the people Daniel had touched. A little girl who had beaten leukemia, clinging to her mother's hand. An elderly man, once diagnosed with terminal cancer but now standing here, alive. Their sorrow was unmistakable, but so was their gratitude. Until the very end, he gave everything for his patients, one of Daniel's colleagues said, his voice catching in his throat as he delivered the eulogy. There had always been stacks of unfinished charts covered Daniel's desk. April had often watched him staying up late, buried in medical records, drafting treatment plans, and analyzing the latest research papers. Whenever she urged him to take a break, he would always respond the same way. Just a little longer. She never realized how those little longer moments had slowly consumed his entire life. As the funeral service neared its end, one by one, attendees stepped forward to say their final goodbyes. In each of their faces, April saw the warmth and gratitude that Daniel had left behind. Then, her mother, Margaret, stepped forward. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her tailored suit still reflected the strictness of her years as a teacher. But today, there was something different in her eyes. Margaret stood in front of the memorial portrait for a brief moment before turning toward April. The church, filled with hushed whispers of mourning, suddenly felt frozen in time. "Don't ever come back," her mother said, her voice as cold as ice. "You chose to marry Daniel. That was the moment our relationship ended. It's over." Gasps rippled through the room. Several attendees turned in shock. Jennifer, standing beside April, instinctively squeezed her hand. April closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was no hesitation in her expression. "I understand," she said, just 3 words, but they carried the finality of a closed door. Without another glance, Margaret turned and walked out of the church. Gone was the usual poised, dignified woman. Instead, her retreating figure seemed rushed, almost desperate. As the service ended and guests gradually departed, April remained standing in front of the altar. Jennifer stayed by her side, silent but present. The colors filtering through the stained glass slowly shifted with the light. "Let's go home," Jennifer said softly. April nodded. As they stepped outside, a cold drizzle had begun to fall, unusual for June in Texas. It carried an eerie weight, as if foreshadowing the isolation that awaited her in the days ahead. From that moment on, her life entered a new phase. During the day, she continued her freelance design work as usual. Evenings were spent eating dinner alone. On weekends, she tended to the garden. But no matter what she did, she always found herself pausing near the white rose bush. She cut off all contact with her family. Calls from her mother went unanswered. Emails remained unread. It was both an acceptance of Margaret's words and a decision to protect herself. Jennifer checked in regularly. Members of the local gardening club would stop by from time to time. And in those small moments of kindness, April would speak to Daniel in her heart. "You were always surrounded by good people." She often sat on the 2-person bench on the terrace, the one they had picked out together, watching the sunset in silence, tears slipping down her face. By September, the streets of Preston Hollow shimmered under the late summer sun. April sat in her home office, immersed in designing a logo for a new client. Work had remained steady, but since losing Daniel, she had thrown herself into it even more. His photo still sat on her desk. But 3 months had passed, and she found herself looking at it less often, not because she was forgetting, but because the pain was too much. Her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a familiar number, her mother. The calls had started a week ago. At first, they came once a day. Then, gradually, they increased. Now, she was calling 5 or 6 times daily. Her voice messages piled up. April, please pick up. I need to talk to you. It's important. Please call me back. The urgency in her mother's voice grew with each message. But April ignored them. Margaret was the one who had severed their bond. She was simply respecting that decision. Then, messages started coming through social media. I really need to talk to you in person. Please just respond. April, you are my daughter. Please. April's finger hovered over the last message. Margaret rarely used words like that. She had always been strict, measured, distant. Now, she was reaching out in a way that almost felt desperate. Doubt crept into April's mind. Am I making the right choice by ignoring her? That night, she called Jennifer for advice. Her friend was quiet for a moment before saying, She must have a reason. Jennifer's words echoed in her mind. That day, there must have been something behind it. Margaret had always been firm, but never cruel. What had pushed her to say those things? Before April could dwell on it further, fate made the decision for her. That evening, the rain returned. It was an unusual September downpour, cold and relentless. April had just finished work and was preparing a simple dinner when the doorbell rang. At first, she considered ignoring it. But the ringing continued. Then came a faint knocking. Then a thud. Something had fallen. A terrible feeling shot through her. She hurried to the door, swung it open, and froze. Her mother was collapsed on the ground, sitting in a dazed heap. Her face was pale, her forehead slick with cold sweat. Mom! April ran forward, instinctively reaching for her. Margaret's body burned with fever. Through shallow breaths, she whispered, I wanted to see you. Then, her eyes fluttered shut. The wail of an ambulance siren cut through the stormy night. The ambulance sped through the quiet residential streets as April sat in the back, gripping her mother's frail hand. Outside, the rain intensified, as if mirroring the gravity of the moment. The paramedics spoke in hurried voices, exchanging medical terms that April recognized instantly, words she had heard countless times from Daniel. But now, they carried a different weight. For the first time, she truly understood how many emergencies her husband had faced, how many lives he had tried to save. Then, the ambulance pulled into UT Southwestern Medical Center's emergency entrance, the same place where she had lost Daniel. The cruel irony hit her like a punch to the gut. She closed her eyes, bracing herself. A doctor in a white coat approached her with a serious expression. Miss Hayes, we've completed the initial examination. April didn't need to hear more. She had spent enough time around doctors to read the unspoken messages in their faces. She already knew. Your mother's condition. The doctor hesitated. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly. We've found pancreatic cancer. It's in an advanced stage. April's mind reeled, the past 3 months flashing before her like a film strip, her mother's relentless attempts to contact her, the unusual urgency in her voice, her abrupt departure from Daniel's funeral, as if something was chasing her. The doctor continued, his voice steady but heavy. We're conducting more tests, but... Another pause. His shadow wavered against the white wall. I'm afraid surgery is no longer an option. April sank onto a hospital bench, the lights above her suddenly feeling too bright. Outside, the late summer rain kept falling. This was only the beginning. By the end of September, the hospital room's window framed a golden sunset. The Texas sky had begun to shift toward autumn. April sat quietly beside the hospital bed, her hands occupied with knitting, something her mother had taught her long ago. Margaret lay still, her breathing slow and shallow. A full week had passed since her admission, and the test results had only confirmed what the doctor had warned. The cancer had already spread. Given the extent of metastasis, we estimate about 3 months. Her mother's attending physician had told her. His voice had been calm, but the words carried an unbearable weight. Hearing that prognosis, April's thoughts had immediately turned to Daniel. How would he have delivered this diagnosis? What expression would he have worn? April. Her mother's weak voice pulled her from her thoughts. She quickly looked up from her knitting. I'd like some water. April grabbed the nearby bottle and helped her mother sip through a straw. Margaret, once so upright and composed, now looked so small, so fragile. After a moment, Margaret exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried through the dimly lit room. April froze. For what I said to you that day at the church, her mother continued. It was cruel. I regret it. April's fingers tightened around the bottle. I already knew about my illness back then. The words hit like a sudden gust of wind. But I had promised Daniel I wouldn't tell you. Daniel. April's breath caught in her throat. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A doctor stepped inside, Dr. John Carter, her mother's primary physician. His hesitation was evident before he finally spoke. Actually, until 3 months ago, your mother's attending doctor was Daniel. April's pulse quickened. What? Dr. Carter nodded. From the initial diagnosis to the start of chemotherapy, he handled everything. Her mind raced. The long hours at the hospital, the late nights at his desk, the exhaustion that had weighed him down. It all made sense now. The treatment was kept secret. Her mother murmured. That was my wish. April turned to her, speechless. Margaret's voice trembled. I didn't want to disrupt your life. I felt so guilty, especially toward Daniel. But he never complained. Not once. April's vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself. He explained everything to me, day after day. Always with that kind, patient smile. Tears welled in her mother's eyes. Watching him, I realized how wrong I was. I said a doctor's wife would be lonely, but I was wrong. Tears spilled onto Margaret's cheeks. But because of me. Daniel. That's not true. Dr. Carter's voice was gentle but firm. Dr. Hayes chose this path. As a doctor. As a husband. As a human being. It wasn't anyone's fault. Outside, the sky had turned a deep orange. Sunlight filtered softly into the hospital room. Margaret exhaled shakily. At the funeral. She paused, her voice breaking. I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt toward Daniel, the regret toward you. It all consumed me. That's why I said those awful things. April rushed to her mother's side, taking her frail hand in both of hers. I wanted to tell you the truth, but by the time I realized it, it was too late. April swallowed hard. I'm sorry too, Mom. Just then, a nurse entered, holding an envelope. We found this while organizing your mother's things. It appears to be a letter from Dr. Hayes. April's hands trembled as she took it. Inside was a letter written in Daniel's neat, familiar handwriting. Dear April, if you're reading this, it means, for some reason, I am no longer by your side. When I chose to take care of your mother, I did so not just as a doctor, but as a son-in-law. I'm sorry for keeping this from you, but this was my decision. Margaret is a good woman. Her love for you runs deep. That's why she made this choice, to put your happiness above everything else. Please forgive Margaret. And no matter what happens, never let go of your family. Even though I'm gone, your choice was never a mistake. Thank you for choosing to be a doctor's wife. With all my love, Daniel. April's hands trembled as she finished reading. The weight of his words settled deep in her chest, pressing against the grief she had carried for so long. Her gaze shifted to her mother, and she realized Margaret's fingers were gripping hers tightly. Mom. For the first time in what felt like forever, they simply sat in silence. No accusations. No regrets. Just an understanding that stretched beyond words. The past, with all its pain and misunderstandings, no longer felt like a wall between them. It was still there, but softer now, something they could reach across. The last light of the sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a golden glow over the room. Outside, a white bird glided effortlessly across the sky. April watched it, something about its flight stirring a familiar image in her mind, Daniel's gentle smile. Tomorrow would come. And with it, the start of something new. A time to find hope, even in the midst of sorrow.